The air at 1,500 feet is thin and biting. Down in the Leri Valley, the world is a chaotic roar of artillery. But up here on the ridge line of Monte Cassino, it should be silent. Then a sound begins to vibrate through the rock, a rhythmic metallic clatter, the heavy wet cough of a Chrysler multi-bank engine. A German sentry from the 4th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, squinting through the dawn mist, would have thought he was hallucinating. There are no roads here, only goat paths and treacherous vertical drops, and yet emerging from the gray shroud like a ghost from the mountain itself, the snout of a 30-ton Sherman tank appears. It's followed by another and another. Steel giants are crawling where only needles were thought to tread. The impregnable rear of the monastery at Monte Cassino is suddenly, impossibly, under the guns of Allied armor. Welcome to World War II Obscura. By early 1944, the Allied drive toward Rome had hit a brick wall. That wall was the Gustav Line, the jagged spine of defenses anchored by the ancient abbey of Monte Cassino. For months, the heights have been cited as an example of a, quote, impregnable position, a fortress that controlled every approach to the Leri Valley. If the Allies wanted Rome, they had to take these heights, but every attack had failed. Thousands of men had been chewed up in the town below or on the bloody slopes of Snakehead Ridge. The stalemate was absolute, and in that desperation, a left-field idea was born, a plan so audacious that Germans never even considered it a possibility. They would build a road where no road could exist. They would drive tanks up a mountain goat track and strike the monastery from the back door. This operation, known as the Cavendish Road attack, reveals the thin, agonizing line between a stroke of military genius and a tragic waste of brave men. To understand why this gamble was even considered, you have to understand the nightmare of the Italian terrain. The quote-unquote soft underbelly of Europe had proved to be as tough as old leather. The autumn rains had turned the valleys into seas of mud, and the Germans had turned every mountain peak into a fortress. Lieutenant General Bernard Freyberg, commander of the New Zealand Corps, was looking for a way to break the deadlock. He knew that if he could get substantial forces in the vicinity of the Massa Alaneda, behind the monastery, the German commander would be forced to abandon the entire Gustav Line. But how? Well, the answer lay in a peasant's foot track only 2 feet wide in places that wound its way up from the village of Kyra toward the high basins below the peaks. It was a path for goats and sure-footed farmers, not for armored divisions. But in February 1944, the engineers moved in. This was not a job for a few men with shovels. This was a massive secret construction project carried out in the dead of night, often under the very noses of the German observers on the ridgelines above. The Indian sappers and New Zealander engineers worked in the dark, carving a 12-foot ledge into the side of the mountain. They encountered a 60-foot-high rock face that had to be blasted away, so they matched their blast with the artillery barrages up the valley. Imagine the tension, the explosions, the roar of the D6 bulldozers, and the constant fear that a German flare would light up the slope and bring in a rain of 88mm shells down their heads. To hide their progress, they erected hundreds of yards of camouflage netting, creating a literal tunnel through which the tanks could eventually crawl. They called it the Cavendish Road. 15 days later, their possible path was ready. On the night of March 15th, the tanks began their ascent. It was an international column of 40 machines. Stuart tanks of the 7th Indian Brigade Recce Squadron and the 760th U.S. Tank Battalion. Following them were the heavy hitters, the Shermans of C Squadron, 20th Armored Regiment, New Zealand Armored Division. The conditions were abysmal. The tracks were barely wide enough for tanks' treads, with a sheer drop on one side and a wall of rock on the other. Inside the cramped, vibrating holes, the crews were blind. Drivers relied on the frantic signals of their commanders to keep from plunging off the ledge. In one of those tanks sat Frank Bice, the gunner for an officer named Harold Buck Renault. He could hear the radio aerials snapping against the camouflage netting as they moved through the long tunnel. Every time the column halted, the silence of the mountain was deafening. They were moving through the clouds, heading for a place called Madras Circus, a natural basin where they would wait for the order to strike. The plan was for the tanks to coordinate with a massive infantry attack by the Gurkhas and the Essex Regiment. The infantry would clear the ridges in the monastery, and the tanks would roll in to consolidate the victory. But in the chaos of the Third Battle of the Casino, the timing fell apart. The infantry attack stalled. The Gurkhas were pinned down on Hangman's Hill. Communications broke down. General Freyberg, perhaps sensing that his chance for surprise was slipping away, made a fateful decision. He ordered the tanks to attack anyway, without the infantry support they desperately needed. As the sun rose on March 19th, tanks surged toward forward from Madras Circus. They forced their way through a narrow lane known as the bottleneck and spilled out into the plateau of Massa Albaneda. The surprise was total. The elite paratroopers of the German army were caught off guard completely. Buck Renault's troop led the way, his Shermans leapfrogging each other across the rough ground. They wiped out machine gun nests and sent Germans scrambling for cover. For a brief moment, it looked like the gamble might actually work. Germans even began to crawl out of the bushes waving white flags. This is where the reality of the war met the brilliance of the plan. The tanks were in the open and they were alone. Without infantry to round up prisoners or clear the snipers from the surrounding rocks, the tankers were vulnerable. The German paratroopers quickly realized the tanks were unsupported. They stopped surrendering and started fighting back. The terrain at Albaneda was a graveyard for armor. The ground was steeply terraced and littered with hidden mines. One by one, the tanks began to fail. American Stuarts threw their tracks on the jagged rocks. Shermans became bogged down in mud or were picked off by anti-tank weapons. And then there were the snipers. The German paratroopers were masters of camouflage. Hidden in the scrub on the slopes of the point at 593 above the tanks, they weren't aiming for the tanks. They were aiming for the commanders who had to keep their heads out of the turrets to see. Frank Bryce remembered the moment vividly. Bullets were pinging off the side of their turret like hail. He warned his officer, Buck Renault, to keep his head down. Renault's hand was on Bryce's shoulder. He was trying to make sense of why they were being fired upon from ground they were told was already being held by our own troops. Suddenly, Renault's weight shifted. He fell on top of Bryce. He'd been shot to the head. He died in seconds. The scene turned into a chaotic scramble for survival. The leapfrogging advance became a desperate slow-motion retreat. Tanks were burning. Crews were bailing out into a crossfire of machine gun and mortar fire. Major Pat Barton, who was trying to coordinate the attack, realized the situation was hopeless. There was no smoke to cover them. There were no infantrymen to hold the ground they'd taken. By the time the order to withdraw was given at 5:30 p.m., the force had been decimated. The cost of the Cavendish Road operation was staggering for such a small-scale action. Of the 40 tanks that clawed their way up the mountain, 19 were lost. 29 men were killed, wounded, or captured. Among the dead were men like Jack Hazlitt and Buck Renault, friends and comrades who'd survived the deserts of North Africa, only to die on a mountain ledge in Italy. 2 months later, when the Polish Second Corps finally took the monastery in the fourth and final battle, they used the Cavendish Road to bring up their own armor. They found the wrecks of the New Zealand Sherman still sitting where they'd been knocked out, a grim trail of breadcrumbs leading to the heart of the German defense. Today, you can still hike the Cavendish Road. The rock scars are still there. The zigzags of the Mad Mile still defy gravity. It stands as a silent testament to a week in March 1944, when the Allies almost turned the tide of the Italian War with a few boxes of dynamite and the sheer will to climb a mountain. If the initial thrust up the Cavendish Road had been successful, the entire strategic landscape of the Italian campaign might have shifted months earlier than it actually did. By seizing Albaneda Farm and securing the bottleneck, Allied tanks would have effectively cut the umbilical cord of the Monte Cassino monastery, isolating the elite German paratroopers from their supplies, and more importantly, blinding the monastery eye that directed lethal artillery across the Liri Valley. A breakthrough here would have bypassed the horrific frontal meat grinder of the town of the Rapido River and likely forced a premature German withdrawal from the Gustav Line. If you want to see more forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with a person or mission you think I should cover next. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is larger than we could ever imagine.